Imagine a world where maybe your racial identity feels as fluid as, say, your online avatar, or perhaps as deeply personal as your innermost self. Is that just science fiction or maybe a looming reality
Hmm.
shaped by evolving social norms and, yeah, surprisingly, technology? Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a topic that's, well, it's complex, it's fascinating, and often, let's be honest, quite controversial: racial customization.
That's right. Our deep dive today is really looking into what racial customization actually means, how people are talking about it in our, rapidly changing world.
And its surprising connections, right, to our digital lives and AI.
Exactly. The connections, sometimes debated ones, to our digital existence and the increasing integration of artificial intelligence. It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, and we've pulled from a really diverse stack of sources for this deep dive. I mean, everything from academic papers, Wikipedia entries, YouTube video transcripts, even online community
Right,
discussions.
trying to get a broad picture.
Our aim is basically to distill the core insights, help you understand the different viewpoints, and really grasp the nuances of this evolving concept, without getting totally overwhelmed. So let's dive in.
Okay.
So, to kick us off, when our sources talk about racial customization, what are they usually referring to?
Well, often they're pointing towards concepts like transracialism or an acronym you might see, RCTA, that stands for Race Change to Another.
RTTA. Okay. And the initial societal reaction, especially it seems in America, tends to be pretty strong.
Oh, definitely. The immediate sort of knee-jerk position, as one source puts it, is that individuals who claim to change their race are often regarded with suspicion. It really bumps up against some deeply ingrained ideas about identity.
It's interesting, though, because while this feels very modern, the idea of shifting racial identity isn't entirely new, is it? Our sources make a distinction between today's transracialism and the historical act of passing.
That's a crucial distinction, yeah. So historically, like after slavery, some black people passed as white. And this was often given a pass, you could say, or at least understood as a survival strategy, a way to find safety or opportunity.
Right, a means to an end in a very specific, oppressive context.
Exactly. But even that historical passing could have its own complex social issues. There's a striking example in the sources of a light-skinned black writer.
Oh, yeah.
He strategically presented as white, kept his hair short, specifically to avoid being pigeonholed as just a black writer. He wanted his work judged on its own merits universally.
Which you can understand, but how was that received?
Well, interestingly, that act was apparently seen as something of a betrayal by some within his own community. It really highlights that tension when someone distances themselves from their assigned group identity, even for understandable reasons.
Hmm.
One source compared it, quite pointedly, to poor people who abandon their poor relatives when they get rich.
Wow, that's a powerful analogy. Okay, so that's historical passing. What about going the other way, as the sources put it, say from white to black?
Yeah, and the figure who immediately comes up in recent memory is Rachel Dolezal. The perception there, often, is that there's somehow less of a reason to do it.
And why is that? What's the thinking there?
It ties into this core understanding, particularly in the U.S., of race as a kind of vertical system. That's a description found in our sources,
The vertical system, meaning?
meaning basically the idea that some people are on the top and some people on the bottom, and that implies certain races are worse off than others. So a voluntary move down this perceived hierarchy seems, well, counterintuitive to many people.
And that very idea that race functions as a hierarchy is itself contested territory, right?
Absolutely. As we found, this observation even shows up in politically charged debates. There's a reference to a letter from the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, signed by Craig Trainer, suggesting that just stating the United States is built upon systemic and structural racism could be viewed as toxic indoctrination under policies aiming to get rid of all DEI. It just shows how loaded even the language around racial hierarchy is.
It really does. And this leads directly into the strong ethical objections that come up, especially concerning white privilege.
Yes, exactly. The argument goes that for a white-born person to claim a black identity is seen by many as a wrongful exercise of white privilege.
Because they haven't lived the systemic disadvantages associated with being black in America.
Precisely. There's a really powerful quote from Tamara Winfrey Harris that captures this. She says about Dolezal, Mrs. Dolezal's masquerade illustrates that however much she may empathize with African Americans, she is not one, because black people in America cannot shed their race. I will accept Mrs. Dolezal as black like me only when society can accept me as white like her.
Wow. That really frames it, doesn't it? It's not just about individual feeling, but about the inescapable social realities tied to race, the permanence of it for those marked by it.
Exactly. It shifts the debate significantly.
So this whole discussion, it pivots pretty quickly from individual choice to these deep-seated societal structures, which brings us to a really crucial comparison point that pops up everywhere in our sources. How does this idea of transracial identity compare to transgender identity?
Right, the parallels are often drawn, but the distinctions are maybe even more revealing. Some sources do float the idea of similar biological underpinnings, though that's very much debated.
Interesting. Is there any data on when transracial identity tends to emerge?
There is actually. A pilot study mentioned suggests it often develops quite early, which, echoes some discussions around gender identity.
How early?
In that specific study, 30.8% identified before age 10 and another 53.9% between 10 and 15. So it suggests, for some, a deep internal sense of self that might not align with external labels, starting young.
Okay, so there's that parallel in terms of early development for some, but then you hit this big philosophical hurdle, right, when you try to map the sex-gender distinction onto race.
Exactly. Cressida Hayes makes this point really clearly. We often distinguish sex, the biological aspect, from gender, the social construction. But Hayes argues that, for race, there's no obvious analogy,
How so?
because the very term race tends to bundle together embodiment and social role.
Mm.
It's harder to neatly separate a biological underpinning from the social meaning in the same way people attempt with sex and gender.
That's a critical point, and it explains why the comparisons often made between Rachel Dolezal and Caitlyn Jenner are so stark.
They really are illuminating. One source describes how the cultural left often treats gender voluntarism,
Hmm.
choosing one's gender identity as almost hegemonic, mainstream, accepted.
Right.
But racial voluntarism, that's often seen as heretical or suspicious at the very least.
And you see that play out in the narratives, don't you? Dolezal chose black identity seen as a lie, opportunistic, maybe benefiting unfairly, definitely cultural appropriation.
Right, that term cultural appropriation comes up a lot, taking elements from a marginalized culture without understanding or respect.
Whereas Jenner,
Jenner was often framed very differently, as simply being a woman, finally being true to her innermost self. It was about authenticity, seen as harming no one.
so the core idea emerging is that gender is increasingly seen as something personal, internal, solely owned and controlled by its individual bearer, as one source puts it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But race, generally not afforded that same level of individual autonomy in the public eye.
Is there a philosophical way to think about group membership here?
Well, Sally Haslanger, the philosopher, offers an interesting perspective. She suggests membership in a gender or race category can be based on how society treats you based on presumed biology or ancestry.
So it's about the social treatment linked to those presumptions.
Kind of. Her account tries to solve problems like, how do we define a group without saying everyone shares some essence? That's the commonality problem. And how do we avoid judging who's a real member? The normativity problem. Her approach tries to ground it in social reality, how society categorizes and treats people, rather than just internal feeling or biology alone. It's a way to navigate these tricky waters.
Which contrasts sharply with Dolezal's own statement, right? How I feel is more powerful than how I was born.
Precisely. That quote highlights the fundamental tension between that internal sense of self and the external social categorization.
And this tension, it seems to be finding new expression, maybe new battlegrounds, when we look at digital spaces and how some people are connecting these ideas to, well, future technology.
It's really fascinating. Discussions and actual communities around transracial identity or RCPA, they're definitely thriving online. You find subreddits, Discord servers.
Like our transracial, trans race.
Yeah, with thousands of members combined in some cases. And Discord servers, too, focusing on controversial topics, including this one. They usually have rules, no harassment, try to create spaces for actual discussion.
But what's this about technology, the transhumanist link?
Right, so within some of these RCTA communities, there's this intriguing connection being made to advanced tech. One poll mentioned in a source actually differentiated between people using things like subliminals, face claims, K-pop videos.
Okay, sort of aspirational online tools.
Right, and those identifying more as transracial transhumanists.
Suggesting a link between changing race and enhancing humanity through tech.
Kind of. The source suggests an interpretation where things like subliminals and stuff are a coping mechanism for the lack of nanotechnology.
Wow. So the idea is that current methods are just placeholders until technology catches up. Like true physical transformation via nanotech or advanced genetics might one day be possible.
That seems to be the implication for some. It's a
Yeah.
very future-oriented view. The same poll actually asked if people would prefer having all the phenotypes associated with your preferred race or being culturally aligned, like speaking the language natively, but stuck as your birth race.
That's a heck of a choice. It really speaks to whether the desire is primarily about appearance or a deeper cultural identification.
It does. It raises questions about what the core desire is.
And while nanotech might be sci-fi for now, we do see people pursuing pretty extreme physical transformations already, don't we?
Absolutely. Martina Big is a very prominent example cited, a white woman who underwent really extensive procedures to appear black.
What kind of procedures are we talking about?
Well, skin darkening injections, changing her eye color, even altering her hair texture, aiming for nappy roots, apparently, and even reporting browner palms.
And didn't she also have significant cosmetic surgery?
Yes, very significant breast implants mentioned as 20 kilos, custom made, costing around $20,000. It shows the extreme lengths some individuals are willing to go to physically alter their appearance in this way.
And this inevitably raises the question, is it a costume or is it somehow real?
Exactly, it pushes that boundary.
Mhm.
And it connects to the broader idea of can you actually change one's race through cosmetics or surgery? Which then spirals into all these deep ethical questions about identity, self-perception, and maybe societal pressures around beauty.
And cultural appropriation again, presumably?
Definitely. These practices ignite huge debates about cultural appropriation and racism. The argument being that adopting features without understanding or respecting their cultural weight is problematic.
It's not just borrowing a look, it's taking something potentially laden with history and meaning.
Right. And beyond appropriation, some argue this pursuit can reflect deeper societal issues, like systemic racism itself and colorism that's discrimination based on skin tone within an ethnic group, which often privileges lighter skin.
So the desire to change could, ironically, reflect the very power structures that create racial hierarchies in the first place.
That's one critical perspective, yes. It's incredibly layered.
Okay, we've looked at personal expression, digital communities, even future tech dreams. But maybe to really get a handle on this, we need to zoom out. Look at the very idea of race. How did we even get these categories? Our sources suggest it's more modern than we might think.
That's a really crucial point. Race, as we currently understand it, is a fairly modern concept. It really only solidified over the past 3 or 4 centuries.
So before that,
People were generally classified differently, more by tribal names or region, Persians, Greeks, Jews, that sort of thing, not primarily by skin color categories.
and the shift towards color-based classification came from where?
Sources point largely towards white supremacy in Europe after the Renaissance period. Figures like the German anthropologist Johann F. Blumenbach are often mentioned as key in developing these classifications.
And the U.S. context is particularly complex, isn't it, given its history?
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. is described as this dynamic melting pot, profoundly shaped by waves of immigration, Western European, African, forcibly through slavery, indigenous Asian cultures. This inherent diversity creates a unique backdrop for all these identity discussions.
Do academics have theories about how ethnicity works? Is it seen as fixed or fluid?
Yeah, there are different camps, as you'd expect. Some theories view ethnicity as pretty fixed, deep-rooted, almost innate. They call it primordialism.
Like it's just fundamentally part of who you are?
Kind of. But others see it as much more fluid, adaptable, a perennial thing that can change depending on the situation. This situational view even suggests ethnicity can be a tool,
A tool, huh?
like used strategically by political groups to gain resources, or as a way societies create hierarchies, social stratification, driven by things like competition and power differences between groups.
And historically, these racial categories, they weren't just descriptive, they were actively enforced.
Very actively policed, yes. The one-drop rule in the U.S. is a stark example. That rule dictated that basically any known African ancestry made a person legally black.
And that led to categories like mulatto just disappearing from official records, like the census?
Exactly. It enforced a rigid binary, which makes it kind of ironic, as one source notes, that recently there's been this reversal.
Oh,
Now, it seems black identity is often more closely policed than white identity, largely because of those concerns we discussed about appropriation and exploitation by outsiders.
Interesting shift. Now, we should probably acknowledge our sources touch on some very controversial and politically charged viewpoints surrounding race.
Yes, and it's important we state clearly. We're reporting on these as they appear in the source material. We're not endorsing them, just relaying what's being discussed or argued in those contexts.
Right. So, for instance, the white genocide conspiracy theory is mentioned in the materials.
It is. This theory falsely alleges that white people are facing some kind of imminent threat of oppression and/or genocide. It's used, unfortunately, to justify white supremacy.
And it uses phrases like the Great Replacement.
Yes, or Eurabia. And disturbingly, this rhetoric has been linked to real-world acts of violence. So again, just reporting its presence in the source documentation.
Okay. So, pulling all these threads together, this deep dive, wow, it really shows just how incredibly complex racial identity is. How it's being actively redefined both by individuals and by society.
And that fascinating interplay, isn't it, between personal self-perception, those shifting societal expectations, and even these emerging technologies, even if some are still just aspirations, like the nanotech idea.
It really does leave you with so many questions about identity moving forward. So for you listening, considering this fluidity of identity, the huge influence of digital spaces, and the potential of future tech like AI.
What responsibilities do you think individuals of societies have in defining identity, respecting personal identity, especially when it challenges those established boxes?
Yeah. And maybe drilling down further, how might AI itself change things? Not just how we perceive race, but maybe how we actually experience and express our identities in the coming decades.
Definitely something to keep thinking about long after this deep dive is over.